Welcome to this final presentation in the series for day 2. This actually deals with a look at wildlife tourism as a case study of the RSPB Down Valley, called From Dereliction to Tourism Hub. And the intention is to look at what is possible from really the absolute worst case scenario of social disadvantage, economic decline, and gross landscape dereliction and pollution to a really vibrant economic and biodiversity hub. So not actually in the Humberhead levels, but situated immediately north along one of the arterial rivers. So I'm going to split this into 2 parts because the overall presentation is quite long, so we will pause part way through. But I want to take you through this particular case study. Okay, RSPB Down Valley, or the Old Moor Wetland Centre, famous now for being one of the sites along with Potterick where the Bitterns have come back, and of course great excitement. RSPB Old Moor, you get an idea of the extent of the wetland habitat. But of course, what people often fail to realise is that the name Old Moor doesn't refer to a lowland wetland area, an extensive wetland area, before the drainage associated with deep coal mining. So this area has a history of wetland. There it is, it's between Barnsley, Rotherham and Doncaster, and the Old Moor Centre itself is the hub of a much wider landscape. The background to this is work I've been doing on all sorts of issues like forgotten fens, industrial landscapes, post-industrial landscapes of Sheffield and South Yorkshire, and my Lost Fenlands work. We also did 3 major reports for the RSPB. These are downloadable from the UK EcoNet website, and that gives you some insight into what we were doing on social and economic issues related to Old Moor going back into the early 2000s. Socioeconomic appraisal of the impacts of the Heritage Lottery Fund support. So we looked at a case study of this reserve, then did a follow-up piece of work to support the RSPB in gaining further funding and informing where that funding might be targeted. This is called Transforming Lives, RSPB Down Valley and the Green Heart Project. And then in 2018, a further review of Old Moor and Down Valley, an update of economic and social impacts. And again, this was looking at quite a detailed micro level of socioeconomic issues and working with the RSPB to draw down further funding to really embed this project in the benefit to local people. So it's really taking the benefits of the nature reserve and the wildlife and the biodiversity, but also embedding that in access to these facilities and to nature, and helping to change the lives of the communities in and around the Down Valley. It started with what things, and I got a quote here from Mike Harding, the folk singer and comedian. What things, a small but very significant move in repairing our damaged world. Well done, everybody, and a heartfelt thanks will be yours from the children of the future. And I think that's a nice way of capturing some of the reasons for what we're trying to do in these situations. So thank you, Mike, for that. My first experience of Worth was not actually with this gentleman, but it felt like somebody akin to this was going as a teenager, parking up in the semi-derelict landscape of Broom Hill in Worth upon Dearne, and being greeted by a very large gentleman on a motorbike. And we thought, oh dear, this is what we've heard about this area. Maybe we shouldn't be here. And he was really friendly. He said, all right, lads, are you looking for the bird reserve? Right, we'll see you down there in half an hour. I'm just on my way down, go down the floodbank and blah, blah, blah. So he was, oh, okay, that's really friendly. And then he turned around and said, don't leave your car there, to be on bricks when you get back. So that was interesting. And there's this group of really determined bird watchers who actually cared for and looked after the site right from the early days. So welcome to Wathings. Other notable people in the area, Brian Blessed. I met him on the Woodhouse Washlands Nature Reserve when we were doing some work. He's a larger than life character, and he grew up not far from Wath. And Michael Clegg, a huge figure in Yorkshire, although today probably fewer people are aware of him, but he was a central figure in actually getting the very strongly York-based Yorkshire Naturalist Trust to take an interest in things. And Michael was a grassroots conservation bird watcher, as well as all the other things that he did on television and with the York Museum Service. So he was actually central, I think, in tipping the balance towards recognising Wath, which was very much a local initiative within the Yorkshire Naturalist Trust, later Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. This is also the landscape of Kestrel for a Knave, the famous book and the film, Billy Casper. And that is set in this evocative landscape that my friend and colleague Mel Jones used to talk so evocatively about. And more recently, Brassed Off, the film about the colliery brass band at Grimethorpe and what happens when the place closes down. And also things like the socio-economic deprivation and the post-industrial health issues. To set this in the wider region, industry brought wealth to South Yorkshire. It also brought gross pollution. This is the River Don in the centre of Sheffield in the late 1800s. And it really was that colour, and it stank. The wildlife had been eradicated. There were no longer any trout or salmon near salmon pastures. And that again was the River Don in the early 1900s. All that remained was sewage, detergent foam, non-biological, non-biodegradable detergent foam, and mutant sticklebacks with 5 eyes. Rivers grossly polluted with sewage, birds poisoned by DDT pesticide and shot when they did attempt to nest. That was actually our first attempted breeding sparrowhawk in a local woodland in Sheffield back in the 1980s, and someone shot it at the nest. But of course, the irony is that as soon as you have water somewhere, that's where kids are going to go and play, regardless of the hazards that they are blithely unaware of. Go down the Don today and it's a vastly changed river, but there's still a lot of sewage pollution from stormwater overflows, which is a bit gross. This is Wath upon Dearne in the 1800s, and you can see the old moor nature reserve and Bolton Ings, and there we have it from above, and you can see the wetlands here and the settlements all the way around. The settlements are generally all on the high ground, so they're away from what were the old floodplains. Manvers Lake, Old Moor, and you can see how there's new factories and distribution centres and warehouses coming into that. But basically all this is floodland, and as soon as you start to make incursions into here, or housing or whatever, you know, close to the valley bottom, then you are lining yourself up for some problems. We can find out a bit about the people who used to live here. These are agreements with the Earl Fitzwilliam, William Thomas Spencer Earl Fitzwilliam, and he's letting a cottage to John Clegg, farm labourer at Wath upon Dearne. And it gives you the conditions. And there's another one, Henry Firth, farmer. So we can actually, from things like these leases, we can get some sort of insight into the people who are living here in the 1800s. It's 1866. And the condition is not to keep a dog without such leave. So in other words, you need permission, and to keep the premises in repair, clean out the ash pit, which is where all the unmentionable waste goes, once in every 2 months, and whenever required by the landlord and his agent. So some interesting insights. This is also the landscape of the pioneering poet and social reformer Ebenezer Elliott, the Corn Law Rhymer. And he actually moved to Brierley and Houghton in the 1800s to take in the healing air and the most beautiful view in England, it was said, as he looked west to the sunset before the collieries, before the great drainage, etc., etc. And he moved from being a little mester in Sheffield, where the pollution was causing havoc with his lungs. So he moved to Grimethorpe area for the healing air. Hargate House that he moved to have built commanded a beautiful and extensive prospect of hills, woods, dales and streams. He wrote about the River Don and the Rother. The Don, like a weltering worm, lies blue below, and Winkerbank before me, rising green, calls from the south, the silvery Rother slow, and smile on moors beyond, and meads between, unrivaled landscape. Amazing. And he spoke as a youngster growing up in Rotherham about seeing kingfishers on the streams and going out as a young boy, looking for natural history, studying the birds, studying the wildlife. This is a landscape with some of the most fantastic ancient woodlands in the country. And the woodlands, ironically, are linked to the industrial past. They were maintained to produce coppicewood and timber for the great ironmasters and steel barons. And that's why we have so many wonderful woodlands. And they had charcoal burners in them. They're the charcoal man at Parkwood Springs in Sheffield. That's the last picture we have of one of these itinerant workers with a traditional wigwam structure covered in turf. And we also had older clog makers. The bluebells are markers of this landscape history. The area has ancient settlements, all away from the core riverside, but here we have Wath Parish Church, very, very historic. Many of the churches are early medieval churches. And here the incumbent was the Reverend Keble Martin, who wrote the concise British Flora, sold hundreds of thousands of copies in the 1960s when it came out. And there he is, became a national figure as an amateur botanist, a cleric amateur botanist. And he was a curate in Wath for quite some years. He'd been warned that Wath would be a difficult parish. The old vicarage had cracks an inch wide from the colliery workings. The original plans from 1790 showed the cellars for 3 kinds of ale and a brew house. The vicar brewed his own beer, which was a common practice. You brewed beer and then you'd have a celebration and you'd sell the beer, and that actually brought in money to support the church. But in 1917, someone had burnt the church down, apparently a local boy with a grudge. He wasn't whipped, but he was sentenced to 5 years in a reformatory. The Dearne Valley is part of the wider South Yorkshire River Don catchment. And you can see here all the rivers. This is as they were before drainage, before canalisation, etc. And then the lower Dearne Valley, marked in blue here, is the floodland. And the point to notice here is how all the settlements are actually to the side. You didn't build on the floodplain. If you didn't then, we do now. So that is an issue. You actually built away from the floodland. Because if you built on the floodplain, A, you would get very wet when it flooded in winter. But B, the floodplain landscape was the most valuable part of your estate. It was where the free fertilizer was carried down as silt and sediment, dumped on the floodplain, and you had very productive grazing marshes, your hay meadows. So this would have been, in medieval times and early industrial times, a traditional wetland landscape surrounded by great ancient woodlands and also common land and heathland in abundance, full of wildlife such as grass snakes, which are still the typical species there. So the rivers Don, Rother and Dearne now form a linear urban wildscape landscape to connect the region. This is a photograph in the early 1900s of the River Don at the Niagara Weir at Worsley Bridge. And you can see there huge stands of butterbur, which is actually quite a good indicator of a decent quality river. So this is before a lot of the damage has been done. And the River Don, extensively canalised, but an artery for industrial traffic. There, a typical industrial barge powered by sail and carrying goods to and fro along the river, coal to the factories and produce from the factories. And it's in the shadow of the great Conisbrough Castle. And you go through the Don Valley Gorge, a beautiful landscape, and overlooking the great Hatfield Chase, the hunting estate of the local magnate and the crown. So imagine a landscape, imagine a time when common eels, which are now very rare, were so abundant that they were able to, the sheer biomass of migrating eels would stop water wheels from turning. And people paid their taxes to the church, their tithes, in barrels of eels. Another use for the wetlands was actually collecting medicinal leeches. And here we've got Yorkshire ladies standing in pools, waiting for the leeches to bite and putting them in their little collecting things to go to the surgeons. In Barker's Pool in Sheffield, the medicinal leeches for Sheffield Infirmary cost £140 in 1836, and a local lady was keeping those and cultivating them to supply. Potterick Carr, not far away, 4,000 acres near Doncaster, one of the many Yorkshire cars, and it fell to John Smeaton's engineers after an Act of Parliament in 1764. Edel Clark, father of Rainbird, in 1887 wrote about how Potterick Carr had vast numbers of duck, bittern, ruff and reeve and black-tailed godwit, marsh harrier, great-crested grebe and waterrail breeding commonly before the Great Drainage. And you can see here the extent of the original wetland, the biggest of the Yorkshire Carrs, and then the mother drain and the other drains going into it. It was a challenging location to drain because you've got very little fall, in other words, very little drop in level to get between your wetland and the river to which you are discharging. Daniel Defoe in the 1720s wrote his travel log across the country. So vast moors, I had almost said waste moors, we entered the most populous part of this county, I mean of the West Riding, only passing a town called Black Barnsley, eminent still for the working in iron and steel, and indeed the very town looks as black and smoky as if they were all smiths that lived in it. Though it is not, I suppose, called Black Barnsley on that account, but for the black hue and colour of the moors, which being covered with heath, or heather it is called in that country, look all black like Bagshot Heath near Windsor. After, I say, we had passed these moors, we came to a most rich, pleasant and populous country, and the first town of note we came to in it was Wakefield, a large, handsome, rich clothing town, full of people and full of trade. Black Barnsley was not about pollution, it was about the heathy and moorland landscape that extended from today's Pennines right the way down into the lowlands. So the view of this was not very positive from people from the outside generally, industry, economy, society and landscape. And for Sheffield, a picture of the Lower Don Valley, and Sheffield is a place to suck you. So we need to think about history when we're actually understanding these landscapes and the future. But the whole mantra was where there's muck, there's brass. Wentworth Woodhouse was the seat of one of the most powerful landowners and industrial barons in the country, the Earl Fitzwilliam. So what happens is people and communities were transformed. We can see this with WAF. There's actually an act from 1846 for paving, lighting, cleansing and otherwise improving the town of Wath upon Dearne. And it talks about if any foundry, candle house, melting place or soap house thereafter to be erected or made, or any slaughterhouse, boiling house for offal, hogsty, unenclosed or uncovered yard, place for deposit or sifting of lime, necessary house, dunghill, manure heap, or other offensive building, place or matter, or in or any near any street within the limits of this act, shall be a nuisance to any inhabitant. And it goes on in detail. And it talks about what sort of vehicles you can ride. And you shouldn't go to a faster pace than a common walk. Every person who shall ride or drive furiously or so as to endanger the life and limb of any person or to the common danger of passengers in any thoroughfare, and blah, blah, blah. And then he goes on to tell you what's going to happen to you. Every common prostitute or night walker, loitering or being in any thoroughfare or public place for the purpose of prostitution or solicitation to the annoyance of the inhabitants or passengers, every person shall willfully and indecently expose his person by bathing or otherwise in any public situation. Every person who shall sell or distribute or offer for sale or distribution or exhibit to public view any profane, indecent or obscene book, paper, print, drawing, painting or representation or sing any profane, indecent, obscene song or ballad, blah, blah, blah. It sounds like Dodge City. Wath-upon-Dearne in the early 1800s sounds like a very dodgy place. And you're in this landscape of gross dereliction and pollution. The River Don and the Rother remained biologically dead until the 1990s. And the air pollution, this is Sheffield city centre in about 1900, it was gross, it was awful. And it's left a legacy, 250 years of heavy industry, widespread legacy, depopulated, derelict urban industrial lands. There's Tinsley Park. And a legacy of heavy metal. I apologise for this one. Good Barnsley band, Saxon. But there is a legacy of heavy metals in the landscape. Some are biologically active, some are not. The rivers have laden burdens of heavy metals in their sediments, along with dioxins, mercury, etc., etc. But there's also a cultural revolution that's occurred with this. Films like The Full Monty for Sheffield, Brastoff, and bands such as Human League, and of course Joe Cocker and Jarvis Cocker, and the Arctic Monkeys, and Richard Hawley. It's a rich, rich cultural legacy. There's also huge areas of post-industrial commons, the post-industrial sites, which if left to themselves, or indeed if manicured effectively, can become biodiversity hotspots, but in a context of deprivation and dereliction. And broken ecosystem services, floods and more floods. And there's been a history of flooding along the River Don, right the way down to the Humber levels, and very much linked to what we've done to the rivers from the top to the bottom, constraining, canalising, etc. And of course, building on the floodplain. So we now have that legacy deeply embedded. And with it, there's a recombinant ecology and many problematic invasive weeds, such as Japanese knotweed, here grown as a very exotic ornamental in the garden. And that's why it was introduced. But also non-native mammals, such as mink, released by animal rights activists in the 1960s and 70s. And Himalayan balsam, again, a joy to children, pinging those seeds out, the catapult seeds, loved by beekeepers and by coarse fishermen. And the cooling towers, we wanted to actually get those decorated, painted up in red, and then 2 giant versions of Bill and Ben, the flower pot men, put in them. Or the other alternative was to have them with giant plastic daffodils, and I thought that would be Sheffield's answer to the Angel of the North, but it never happened. The end for the natural environment for many, many decades for Wath-upon-Dearne came with a Wath-upon-Dearne Gas and Coke Company. And here we see a share certificate in 1844. And when you get coal, when you get deep mine coal, you often get chemical works. And when you get chemical works, you get gas and coke. And these are terribly, terribly polluting. So they generate income, they generate some economic wealth. Most people actually in the area live in dire conditions, but obviously for the owners, they live in rather better. So we have things like Wath Main, and you can see the scale of impact on this once vast wet landscape, the old moor, Wath Manther's Main, and again with the barges carrying the coal to where it's going to be used in industry. and substantial canals to take these loads, carrying the coal one way, carrying the manufactured goods the other way. And then come the railways, which to some extent torpedoed the economic value of the canals, but the railways then formed the arteries. And Wath was a vibrant place. It had a significant population. I mean, you see here, I like this one because this actually shows Chesterfield, who is still quite a big football club, and they are playing Saturday, November 20th, 1925, kickoff 1:45 p.m. against Wath Athletic FC. So it was quite a big place, quite a big football team. It had its own ground, etc. And very popular with the miners, angling clubs and other sporting clubs. And then the Wath Joint Rescue Brigade. Hazard and tragedy haunted these places, the deep mines, and there had to be a rescue team ready to go at short notice. You can see the degree to which these are despoiled landscapes, absolutely hammered. This is the sort of Wath, Ings area. Wath, Main, about 1960. Okay, we will take a break there for about a quarter of an hour, and we'll come back to the second half.